The old city hospital had long been abandoned. It stood on the outskirts of the city, amidst a thicket of bushes and trees, deteriorating every year. It was said to have once treated patients with the rarest of ailments. But once there was a fire, many patients and doctors died. Now the building attracted only adventurers, bloggers, and those who liked to explore abandoned places. Among them was Lera, an aspiring photographer who dreamed of capturing the darkest corners of the city. They say you can hear whispers there at night. Her friend Dima warned her when she suggested going there. The place is cursed. Whispers? Lera grinned. Great, that'll add atmosphere to my pictures. They agreed to meet outside the hospital late at night. Lera, armed with her camera and flashlight, arrived first. The building towered above her, its windows gaping empty and its doors seeming ready to slam shut. When Dima came up, they went inside together. It's creepy, he whispered, looking around. But you'll get great shots, Lera replied, clicking her camera. With each step, the silence grew thicker and the air colder. The walls were covered in mold, and the floors creaked underfoot. Listen, did you hear that? Dima suddenly asked, stopping. Lera listened, a barely audible whisper, as if someone was talking at the other end of the corridor. It must be the wind, she said, trying not to show excitement. There's no wind, he whispered. They went deeper into the building, and the whispering grew louder. It came from different corners, echoing through the corridors. In one of the rooms, Lera found an old patient log. On its yellowed pages were entries with unreadable notes, but one line stood out. They hear us. They always hear us. What nonsense, she muttered, showing the find to Dima. He flinched when there was a sound like someone walking on the ceiling. Lera, I don't think that's a good idea, he began, but the girl was already heading for the stairs leading upstairs. On the second floor, the whispering became even louder. It now sounded like dozens of voices speaking at the same time. Is this a recording? Lera asked, feeling anxiety overwhelm her. But then the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. Let's get out of here, Dima whispered. But at that moment Lera's flashlight flickered and then went out completely. She lit the phone and noticed a shadow standing at the end of the hallway. A figure, barely recognizable, froze and stared at them. Who are you? Lera shouted out, but the shadow disappeared, leaving behind a new whisper. Why did you come? Go away. Lera and Dima felt the temperature in the room plummet, and the door behind them slammed shut with a loud bang. Lera and Dima froze as the door behind their backs slammed shut. The echo of the knock echoed through the hallways, coming back to them in an ominous whisper. Was that wind? Dima whispered, but there was a tinge of panic in his voice. Hardly, Lera replied, her gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. They tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if something was holding it from the other side. Let's find another way out, Lera said, trying to sound calm. They moved on down the corridor, but the whispering began to grow again. It was coming from everywhere, blending into words that were hard to make out. Lera shined her flashlight on the walls and ceiling, trying to find something unusual, and soon she noticed there were wet footprints on the floor, as if someone had been walking barefoot down the dusty hallway. Do you see these? She asked, pointing at them. Dima nodded, his face pale. Those aren't our footprints. That's for sure, Lera answered, trying not to give in to fear. They followed the footprints, which led them to a large chamber. It looked different here. The walls were covered in rust, and there was a smell of burning in the air. On one of the beds lay an old white robe. There was a stain on it that looked like a bloody handprint. We are not alone here, Dima whispered. As soon as they entered the room, the whispering became louder, turning into barely audible words. Fire, close the doors, we can't get out. Lera felt a chill run down her spine. It's the memories, she said. These voices, it's like they're stuck in here. Maybe that's why they call this place cursed, Dima suggested. He wanted to suggest leaving, but his attention was drawn to the mirror in the corner of the room. It was cracked, but there was something shining in it, as if a flame was moving in the reflection. Look, he said, pointing to the mirror. In the reflection, behind their backs, a figure appeared. It was a woman in a white robe, her face burned and her eyes blank. She raised her hand and whispered. They didn't make it. When Lera turned around, the woman was gone, but her image remained in the mirror, as if watching them. We have to get out of here, now, Dima said firmly. And this time Lera didn't argue. They ran back down the corridor, hoping to find another way out, but the faster they moved, the louder the whispers became, turning into screams. When they reached the stairs, the way down was blocked by collapsed debris. "Shit, we're trapped," shouted Dima. At that moment, Lera noticed that an inscription scratched out by someone had appeared on the wall next to the stairs. "Go to the third floor. The truth is there." "It's a trap," Dima said, shaking his head. "Do we have a choice?" Lera replied, heading for the stairs leading upstairs. The hospital looked different on the third floor. Here the walls were black with soot, and a heavy smell of burning hung in the air. In one of the rooms, they saw a table on which were burnt folders with documents. Among them Lera found a sheet that by some miracle had survived. It was a report on the fire. At the bottom of the document in red paste was written, "The fire started downstairs, but the doors were locked. It was no accident." As soon as Lera read it aloud, the flashlight's light flickered and a new whisper rang through the hallway. They knew. The whispering grew louder, as if the walls of the hospital had come alive and were now whispering in different voices. Lera was holding a document with red marks on it, and her hands were almost trembling. The doors were locked. Dima repeated, "Had someone done it on purpose?" "It looks like they did," Lera answered. "This place, someone wanted to make sure no one could get out." The whispering was suddenly replaced by a heavy sound, as if something heavy had fallen on the floor above. "What was that?" Dima asked fearfully, looking around. "Let's check," said Lera, trying to suppress her fear. They moved further down the third floor. The corridors were covered with soot, and the air was getting heavier. In one of the rooms, they found a strange room. It was a large ward, but instead of the usual beds, there were iron bunks with cage-like bars. "Is this a prison ward?" Dima asked, his voice trembling. Lera came closer and noticed scratches on one of the bunks. They were words carved into the metal. "The fire took us, but they opened the door." "Who's they?" Lera whispered, feeling a chill run down her spine. As they headed toward the room's exit, the whispering grew louder, changing into explicit words. "We can't leave. Help us." Lera turned around and saw a figure standing behind one of the bunks. It was a man in hospital pajamas, his face contorted with pain and his hands clutching iron bars. "Can you see it?" she asked, but Dima stood motionless, as if he didn't notice anything. The figure raised its head, and smoke began to stream from its empty eye sockets. "Leave while you can," it whispered. Lera closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, the figure was gone. They continued walking, but with each step the whispers grew louder. When they reached the end of the corridor, they heard the sound of footsteps coming from above. "Someone is here," Dima whispered. "We already realized that," Lera answered. They found a staircase leading to the fourth floor. Dima tried to object, but Lera had already started to go up. "We have to understand what happened here," she said without stopping. The fourth floor was almost completely destroyed. The ceiling had collapsed in several places. The walls were black with soot, and there were charred objects on the floor. In the center of the floor, they saw a large hole leading down, as if the fire had started here. Lera stepped closer and noticed that there were words written around the hole. "We screamed, but they didn't hear us. They locked us in here." "Who's they?" Lera repeated, but at that moment she heard a voice behind her. They always knew. She turned around and saw the same woman in the white robe she had seen earlier. Her face was now completely covered in burns, and her eyes glowed with a dim light. "Have you come to find out the truth?" she asked. Lera nodded, though her heart was racing. "Then be prepared that she won't let you go," the woman said, disappearing into the smoke. At this moment, a deafening roar sounded from the hole, and footsteps began to echo throughout the floor, as if dozens of people had risen from the ground. "Run!" Dima shouted, but the stairs behind them had already disappeared, leaving them alone with the whispers and shadows. The footsteps grew louder and louder. The sounds, like heavy boots, echoed around the fourth floor. Lera and Dima pressed themselves against the wall, trying not to make a sound. "What's that?" Dima whispered, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but we'd better not attract their attention," Lera replied, looking around for cover. Shadows began to appear from around the corners, vague at first, but with each passing moment their outlines became more and more human. One of the figures stopped right in front of Lera. She was pale, her eyes glowing with a dim blue light, and her clothes resembled hospital pajamas. Can you hear us? She asked. Lera wanted to answer, but the word stuck in her throat. They didn't save us. The shadow continued. They knew the doors were locked. They watched us burn. Lera felt the coldness stiffen her body. Who did this? She whispered at last. Shadow raised her hand and pointed to a hole in the floor. The answers are in there. Lera and Dima walked to the edge of the hole. There was a faint smoke rising from it, and somewhere down there was a flickering light. You're not going down there, are you? Dima asked. We have no choice, Lera answered. They found the wreckage of the stairs leading down. Each step was echoed by a loud thud, amplifying the whispers around them. When they reached the basement, Lera realized that the air was different here, heavy with the smell of burning and something metallic. In the center of the cellar was a massive iron door. There were deep scratches on its surface, as if someone had tried desperately to get out. This is where it all started, Lera said, looking at the door. She reached for the handle, but Dima stopped her. You don't know what's behind that door. What if it's the only way to end all this? She replied, pushing his hand away. When the door opened, a large room stood before them. Burnt documents hung on the walls, and in the center stood a table with a box covered in soot. Lera walked over to the box and carefully opened it. Inside were photos, snapshots of patients, staff, and keys. They were the keys to the locked doors of the hospital. Among the pictures, she found a note stained with blood. We locked them. It was the only way to stop the spread. They tried to isolate the patients, Lera whispered, reading the note. But the cost, Dima began, but at that moment there was a loud creak. The iron door slammed shut behind them. Shadows began to fill the room. They have come for the truth, came a voice from the darkness. It was the woman in the robe. Her face was now completely burned and her arms were outstretched toward Lera. You have discovered their secret. Now you must decide, leave it here or become part of us. No, Dima shouted. We just want to leave. There is no leaving, answered the woman. Lera clutched the keys in her hand and realized her decision would determine their fate. The room filled with a cold wind, and the shadows began to approach. Whispering voices merged into a single chorus. The truth had been revealed. Now decide, leave or stay. Lera stood in the center of the room, clutching a bunch of keys in her hand. Her gaze darted between the box of photographs and the woman in the white coat, whose burned face was blank and devoid of emotion. We don't have time. Lera, Dima shouted. He tried to open the door, but it was locked. If we leave, this will never end, Lera whispered, feeling her voice shaking. Then just leave it, he shouted in desperation. Shadow memories. The woman stepped closer, her movements slow but eerie. We were burning, she said, her voice sounding simultaneously in the room and in Lera's mind. They locked us in here to save themselves. Lera looked at the pictures in the box. Among them were the faces she had seen among the shadows. They were the ones who died in the fire. Do you want me to bring justice? She asked. We want peace, the woman replied. You must open the doors and show the truth. Lera looked at the keys. One of them stood out. It was bigger than the others and covered with strange symbols. What will happen if I open them? She asked. The forest will go up in flames, the woman replied, but we will leave. Lera stood in front of the old door, from behind which came a faint humming sound. She put the key in the lock and turned it. When the door opened, a bright light burst out of it. The voices of the shadows intensified, and Lera felt the cold disappear, giving way to heat, as if the flames had returned to the place. The shadows began to fade, their silhouettes dissolving into thin air, and the voices grew fainter and fainter. The woman in the robe stopped at the threshold and turned to Lera. You gave us freedom, she said, but now the forest will remember you. And with these words she disappeared. When everything was quiet, Dima grabbed Lera's hand. Let's go before everything collapses, he said. They ran back through the corridors, which were now illuminated by a faint warm light. Doors that had been locked before were now open. As they ran out of the hospital, the building began to crumble. Walls were falling and flames were shooting out of the windows. We got out, Dima whispered, breathing hard. Lera turned around. The hospital seemed to disappear, leaving behind only a black silhouette against the starry sky. A few days later, Lera returned to the city. She printed the photos she had taken at the hospital and found that they had new details, shadow faces, silhouettes of the people she had seen, and lights floating in the air. She realized that the connection to the hospital remained, and sometimes, as she looked through the pictures, she could hear a faint whisper coming from deep inside her mind. Thank you for your freedom.